Right. Well, we have the band back together after a little reprieve and everyone's travel with John Vervaeke, Chris, Jordan, and myself. So first, I'll give some context, but first some housekeeping. So Circling, the company that I own that and teach at, we have weekends. We have an open Thursday night. We have a year-long program. All of that currently online. All of it open for registration. I also do one-on-one coaching. So if you're interested in that, all the links for that is below. My email is below for the coaching. All right. So this is so good to get back together with everybody. And it goes deep and it goes wild. This one we really start to, what unfolded is a conversation about the self and different possibilities of what a self would look like that isn't based in some way inside of a narrative structure, right? And some of the implications of that and the possibilities of that. I have a feeling it's going to be the beginning of a whole probably series of dialogues that are going to be coming up. So it definitely stretched my mind and my heart, and just great affinity for these conversations and for there's four of us, but the fifth person is I think what we have allegiance to. So enjoy. Welcome.
It's good to be here with all of you again.
Likewise.
I like your hair, guy.
The COVID.
I like the beard, Jordan.
Oh, yeah, thank you. This is my RV beard.
Very nice.
Yes, you've been. I haven't quite gotten the scoop on what you've been doing. I know something about RVs and trips and nervous systems coming back. Other than that, I don't know much.
I've been experimenting with learning exactly how bad an idea it is to take your wife and 2-year-old on a 8-week RV trip into no man's land. No more than 3 days at one spot. Every day a new place. Brand new RV that we've never used before that broke most of the time.
It sounds like a Disney movie.
Yeah, or that the Chevy Chase series back in the day.
Yeah.
What was there a purpose to?
Well, there was a number of different purposes. One of which was to actually visit some of the places that we've thought about in this thing that I've been calling Civium. That might be good locations to launch one. Visit groups of people that were doing something in that direction. Although that didn't work out so well because, as it turns out, there's a high correlation between groups of people that are doing things intentionally together and people who are closing up shop for COVID. So many of the places that we had intended to visit, and in fact had planned on visiting, as we were moving through the country, kind of pulled up the drawbridge and said, maybe next year.
Yeah.
Getting a feel for different kinds of places under the same context, under the sort of the Civium research. And then the flip side of that was actually at the level of the family, experimenting with different contexts that the family was operating under and getting a sense of what worked and what didn't work. So being in a very narrow driveway where we couldn't put out the slides with the inability to run the generator and the furnace going out on election night, as it turns out, with the 2-year-old getting a stomach virus and throwing up and vomiting, doesn't work. That's like not a good idea. Other things do work.
I admire you, my friend. My 2 sons are now 16 and going to be 25. And I don't think I could do a 2-year-old again. That's a pretty heavy boulder to push up a very long hill.
Yeah, she's a tough one. She's got a lot of energy. So she's sort of teach me a lot about the essence of 2-year-olds. Like my previous two daughters, obviously transitioned from 1 to 3 in the ordinary fashion, but neither really like hit hard onto it. But this one she's earning her too. What have you guys been up to for the past 3 months?
Well, Jordan, you and I already talked about that. We caught up already.
Yeah.
I'm going to upload that video soon. Yesterday was my birthday, so that was thank you. The two other gentlemen have already wished me happy birthday. Chris gave me an amazing card. It's a card that opens up, and then there's a sailing ship that comes into form out of paper, and then he's inscribed one of my favorite passages from Moby Dick into the. And it was just like, wow, it's super cool. So that's other than that, as I said, I've been working a lot on the Dialectic into Dialogos project with Chris, with Guy. Also working on the relationship between Dialectic into Dialogos and the Kyoto School's attempt to integrate Eastern and Western philosophy as a response to nihilism. And I think that's very fruitful ground. Chris and I have submitted a paper we're hoping to get published on that connection. And go ahead, Guy.
Paper you guys wrote Chris sent me the current version of it. Very good.
Glad you think so. Thank you for saying that. So these things are uppermost in my mind, and they were in the discussion that you and I had, Jordan. But I'll let Chris and Guy say what they've been doing as well.
Yeah. Well, I overlap obviously significantly with that. I feel like I've just been in a wind tunnel of projects uninterrupted for the last 3, but really like the last 8, 9, 10, and I think that now, I mean, we had this gauntlet of projects, John and I, to get through and to get finished. And around mid-November, I think we finally worked ourselves free of that gauntlet. But it's sometimes it feels like a bit of a Pyrrhic victory to get finished something like that. I find, I find being 98% finished something is ecstatic, and being 100% finished is despair. So, I always look forward to being unencumbered but when the time comes, I always find myself just at a loss, and like the needle and the compass just starts spinning.
Yeah.
So it's been it's been nice, that the newfound freedom, but it's also been disorienting.
Well, we do have another project coming up very shortly, so.
Yeah, yes. So fear not.
The next one.
The next one is Chris and Greg Enriquez and I are going to film the elusive I, capital I, the nature and function of the self, in a way that has a similar structure to Untangling the World Knot, in which I'm going to present across a series of, I don't know what they are, lectures, an argument, and then Greg and Chris will add to it, modify it. They'll be basically Socratic interlocutors with me about the project. Greg and I found that was extremely successful for Untangling the World Knot, and because not only was the content relevant to what a lot of us are talking about, the manner of the presentation was also very exemplifying of a lot of the stuff we are all talking about. There was moments when important insights were generated that were generated just in the Dialogos. I didn't have them a forethought coming in. Greg didn't have them a forethought coming in, but in the interaction, some pivotal moves were made. And so the argument, it sort of became more ecstatic while not losing any of its rigor. And so we were both very pleased. And then Greg and Chris have met and they've hit it off. And so we're wanting to do that next, because Chris and I have also had, over the years, especially because of his interest in Kierkegaard, we've had an ongoing discussion about the self, of course, which is another thing that is coming under pressure for reinventio in the midst of the meaning crisis.
Mm-hmm.
We're losing a sort of common consensus about what the self is and what that means. And that overlaps with some of Jordan's topics like sovereignty and other things like that in important ways. So I thought the series would be very timely.
Well, I like just the measurement that you proposed, right? The ecstatic de rigor.
Yeah, yeah.
Seems like
Well, this raises the I think one of the more interesting issues of the moment, which is that I suppose on the one hand, we humans have gone through shifts of this kind of sort a couple of times.
Yeah.
Poison 3 times, 500 times, somewhere in between, where things like the nature of self is significantly changed in content. But maybe never before, and certainly rarely, has it been one where we actually have both an awareness of that fact and even an entire theoretical model to describe what's happening and how it might end up moving. Yeah. So the ability, and one might propose, in fact, given the time frame, so in some sense the necessity to actually leave from port and in fact sail somewhere with some intentionality is astounding. And then I suppose the other thing is just kind of continue to hammer home that degree, like the degree of change is very difficult, I think, for almost anybody, to be frank, to really feel comfortable with, and therefore oftentimes to grasp. Like so, in many cases, I find that there's a sort of a recoil, like there's a walking into it, oh wow, and then oh shit, and then kind of a backing away. But if you can really say with seriousness that, oh yes, this notion of self, here's some examples of how it's shifted over time in very, very big ways, and we're going to be doing that kind of thing, and soon, like over the next generation or so. It's, I think, helpful to orient people to the kind of the level of effort and the degree of difference that they simply should be expecting to navigate and participate in across the board.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Wow.
I think that's very well said. I mean, that's part of the reason why I want to take this topic up. I mean, on one side, the self is the gravity well of all of our biases. They ultimately all are about, in some sense, the self. And then, of course, as soon as we're invoked, and then we have a problematic overlap between the sense of self and understanding that our cognition is self-organizing, recursive. And what's the relationship, for example, as we become more aware of the dynamical nature of cognition, the self-organizing nature? Here's a question that you could raise. I don't think there's a simple answer, but just to bring out the difference. Is there anything to the self beyond self-organization? Is there anything to the self beyond? So there's two senses of self. There's one as a noun that points to some entity, some soul-like entity perhaps. And then there's the self as a grammatical function that points to a process being recursive. Like, the table collapsed upon itself. It doesn't mean that all the wood moved towards the soul of the table. It doesn't mean that. It's a recursive process. And so and we think of as a tornado as being self-organizing, but it doesn't possess a self, or it isn't a self. And so as we're discovering a lot of this cognitive science about how the self is the gravity well of biases, and as we are getting more and more sophisticated dynamical systems models of self-organization, the self is being put under pressure, right? Other things that are putting it under pressure. We have tried for a very long time to situate the self in terms of a self-writing autobiography. The self is a story. You'll see this all the time. The self is a story that writes itself, and people think that's amazing, but it's a very problematic thing to say, because as we've learned over the last 40 years about the massively reconstructive nature of memory, right? It's not a story that's writing itself, right? Your memory is not like a computer file. It's more like a compost heap. The things on the surface look pretty much like they were when you first put them in. But as you go deeper back into your memory, everything is dissolving and compressing and integrating with itself. So the sense that there's some essence that's running through it is being undermined. It's very similar to how Wittgenstein pointed out that we thought lots of categories had an essence, like game or chair or table. And it turns out they don't have an essence. It's just a bunch of overlapping things with no line of continuity running throughout them. And so as we've discovered the nature of reconstructive memory, that's also called the self into question. And then of course, we also have, and this is interacting with what's happening sort of socioculturally with identity politics. And I have we been recording throughout, or no, we lost all of that?
We lost it when Guy was recording, so now we're recording again.
Yeah.
So when you were gone, the recording was gone.
Let me give somebody permission. I'll give you guys permission to record too, in case you want to.
What happened, Guy?
Allow record. My internet went down.
So I noticed that there's an interesting, like a self-referentiality from the point of view of, I guess, Guy, that anyone else who happens to be watching that video, which is to say that you just had an aphasia in the context of the larger self of which you were participating. So you know, the John, Chris, Jordan subset of the Sangha you know, did stuff, but you actually have no memory of it because it's elided from this particular mode of memory, which is of course a big part of the now distributed cognition sensorium. And I think that's actually a really nice way of like, oh, okay, that's that for sure. And if you think about the continuity of self has something to do with memory, or at least the ability to access events that occurred in the past, as well as to access events that are occurring now. And interestingly, something about being able to engage in some kind of forward modeling. I'm not exactly sure how that works. The transposition of the fraction of referencing events that occurred in the past that are stored in my meat space is, of course, diminishingly small and getting smaller by the nanosecond. And so this ability to say, oh no, precisely when a video turns off, I'm watching, I'm connecting, I'm part of the flow, I'm part of the conversation. There's something going on where my attention is being to come into harmonic resonance with what's going on. And then the video stops and it starts back up again. And there's like a gap in the middle. That's a good experiment for the feeling of the thing that we were just talking about.
Yeah, what we were talking about, Guy, to loop you in, is I was talking about all the pressures coming out of cognitive science on the notion of the self as a single sort of stable, solid thing, the sort of soul model, this Cartesian Christian model. And it has to do with that we're discovering how massively self-organizing our cognition is. And as it becomes increasingly self-organizing, we might not need a boss or a self behind any of that. There might be no self beyond self-organization. We talked about how the sense of self is distributed both externally and internally, between the hemispheres and between the brains. And then we started talking about how the self is necessarily embedded socially. And then, and Chris was emphasizing that point. And then I tried to bring the 2 points together into Jordan's idea about the civium, where you have these two levels in which people are socially embedded. They're sort of embedded paleolithically in an embodied, ecology in which a self is taking shape there, but then they're going to move into the hyperspace of the cyber civilization, and that's going to be a totally different sense of self. And the sense of self that has to mediate between them, the narrative sense of self that we got from Odysseus and the early axial poets, that narrative sense of self that has been celebrated, isn't set up to handle that problem. It isn't set up to handle how can we move in this multiply fractal way, this multiply dynamically self-recursive way between the embodied paleolithic self and the disembodied cyber self, if I can use those as catchphrases. And we increasingly are needing to do that. And as Jordan just pointed out, we hit it just a few minutes ago, in the way our identities were fragmented by what was happening here. And so I sort of posed that question to Jordan, and that's where we're at. So it looks like we're going to get into a dialogos about the need for the probability that the sense of self is going to go through another historical change, like it did in the axial period, etc. and what that might look like and why it's difficult for it to happen. So, yeah, because the thing about the self is it's one of its unique properties, if there is such a thing, is the sense of self is to some significant degree contributive and constitutive to being a self, right? Your sense of self contributes to the self you are in a way that your sense of anything else doesn't. Maybe your body, but we tend to think of our body as part of ourself.
Yeah, so as some people know, I got myself kicked off Facebook for reasons that nobody really knows, and I've got myself kicked back on Facebook like yesterday or the day before for reasons that, again, at least I don't know. Right. There was a very interesting, so I posted once. I may not post anymore because I noticed a very, actually this is quite useful to share. I noticed going back to Facebook after having been off Facebook for a full month was a lot like I imagined the experience of like smoking cigarettes for the first time after having kicked cigarettes for a long time. It felt icky. Like it felt like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, this is a dirty thing to be doing. I felt dirty going back to Facebook. So I gotta let you all know, it's probably not healthy. But I wrote something, a post, and in the comment stream, there's a little bit of a question about whether or not this was really me, which I thought is an interesting question. Right? Now, my friend Jeff Gomez said something. He said, "It's Jordan, all right. You can hear his cadence through the text." Right? Now, think about this in terms of the context of the notion of self. Something like a consistent, or consistent may be the right term, creative function. Something that consistently leaves a signature effect on world as it is expressing itself into world. So regardless of the underlying medium, if I could sort of like witness a pot turned by John Vervaeke, and you could somehow discern the John Vervaeke signature on that pot, I would be able to say, oh yeah, this was caused by or produced by, created by. So if you think of like the self is that something that expresses itself, where it acts as an agent of creation in world, and it has a unique signature that you're able to discern the fact that it was the agent of creation of some particular piece of world.
That for me brings out that's good. I want to riff on it because it brings out sort of a fundamental tension. And maybe it's the tension, maybe, I don't know if it's also a tension between before and after the stage transition, the phase transition, but it's the tension between that we want the self to do two things, and this of course was made famous by Tillich, that go in opposite directions. We want the self to be, as you said, Jordan, a unique signature of our presence in the world, but we want the self to be that which connects us to other things profoundly and deeply. We want to be simultaneously connected, and our self is our sense of self, and I've already argued that's in part constitutive of ourself, is really put somebody in Tom Hanks, Castaway, right? His sense of self and his identity collapses. He almost loses his personhood and his humanity. That's clearly indicated, right? And he has to create another. He has to create Wilson in order to preserve what little self he has, right? So we want the uniqueness, but we want the dependent connectedness, and they pull on each other. And our standard models for that, at least the Cartesian soul model and the romantic story model, don't really give us what we need, because here's what I'm proposing to you guys. That tension is going to be magnified as we enter what I've been talking about, as we enter the pull between these different ecologies within which the self is embedded.
What's interesting is that tension that you talked about is exactly the same tension that is the anxiety that one goes through in becoming intimate, in moments of intimacy.
Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Great connection. Go.
Where there's this part of me that's just wants to emerge with the cosmic tit of belonging forever, right?
Yeah.
And then there's another core drive, which is to be cosmically unique in my singular specialness, right? We'll say. And so an intimacy is usually these moments where on some level the thing that sparks the intimacy is where, okay, what's actually true for me? If I say it, I may threaten the relationship, right? And so if I don't say it though, I lose myself. If I do say it, I may lose the relationship. And it's like there's that back and forth, and it's usually that trembling that happens, like when you're getting ready to really like say the thing that invites intimacy, is still saying it, right? And then in the capacity to navigate, abide in, and stay with the anxiety, right, is in moving towards it, is the thing that opens up into intimacy. It's those moments where you cross that threshold, and it's usually those moments like in relationships where they really are transforming, because it's usually the thing that I'm most afraid of, right? By the time I say it and I get on the other side, I'm no longer the same person that started the sentence, that completes the sentence, right? So there's this moment of where, oh my God, the threat from before I said it to after I said it catapults us into a completely different, it can be very, very transformative. So this kind of, I think that there is this tension, right, that happens in a relationship.
I just want to flag what you said, and I don't know if I'll say much about it, but that idea, the connection between selfhood and intimacy, and Chris will probably want to talk about eros here, but the way you also, because you kept using the word and you framed it the way L.A. Paul talks about transformative experiences. I don't know what I'll be after I say this in the intimacy. I don't know what I'm going to lose when I speak, but I don't know what I'm going to miss if I don't speak, right? And you're caught in the transformative paradox. And as you say, yourself is at risk in a fundamental way. You're right. Your perspective and participatory knowing are going to go through a huge thing, right? And so there, and notice what you're trying to do. You're trying to get it. This is what's really exciting. You're trying to get an optimal grip.
Yeah,
you're trying to get an optimal grip. You see what I'm thinking here? I'm thinking that there's a level of relevance realization in the distributed, individuated self, right? That there's the trade-off relationships. There's a constant trade-off between individuation and participation. That's like the trade-offs between efficiency and resiliency, explore and exploit. But it's the fundamental, machinery, right? That is constitutive of the self. Yeah. Anyways, I just want put that out there as a sort of riffing on what you just said, because I thought that the connections you were making were really important.
What does it say about the self that in order to be itself, to really be itself, seems to call forth the risk of itself, right?
Because this is the no thingness of the self, right? Yes, the self, right? The self is something that can only be itself by internalizing something other than itself and connecting itself to something other than itself. That if it was truly monadic, it wouldn't be a self. It wouldn't exist.
Yes. And that's the function then of the dialectical generation, right? Because the individuated self is reproduced of its participation. And somehow then the confrontation with the no-thingness of the self has to be emboldened by the realization that the individuation will be endowed de novo by the participation. And that's what happens in intimacy.
Right. True. So it's the recognition that the embodiment of the self, the selfingness of the self into actuality must be released to actually create the possibility of the selfingness to reself itself back into actuality in a richer, deeper, more powerful, more nuanced, and more intimate way.
Yeah. And notice what you're doing, and this is you do this often brilliantly, Jordan. You turn the self into a verb. Mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. You just transposed the fundamental grammatical category that we're using in order to try and talk about it. And I think that is something to also take note of. And that went right into my chest when you made that move, when you turned it into a selfing that can reself itself. I mean, that was just like, that went like right here. That was fantastic. So the thing is, I know we're all sort of in a space now, but I want to pick up the thread that Jordan also put out there, which is he noted that there is going to be resistance, right? If that's the right word, to this phase transition, right? There's resistance to trying to think of the self other than what we've been given by the axial heritage. And so, for example, when like in cognitive science, there's this huge debate, the self versus no self debate. And, you know, you have people on one side saying, well, the self is real, and people like Metzinger on the other side, or Hood, saying that the self is an illusion, and they go back and forth. And part of what's going on here is an undisclosed discussion, an implicit, actually non-discussion about what realness means. So there's a deep, and this is something I hope we can tease out of, there's a deep connection between this, what Jordan just did, right, about the sense of self and the sense of realness that are somehow deeply interpenetrating. And because what you get at is people say the self is an illusion because it's not a stable object with an essence. But if we had that standard of reality, you know what we'd end up saying in the face of modern science? That everything is not real. Tables and chairs and body. Where does that stop? You would go, the only thing that would be real would be sort of quantum probability waves, and everything else would be an illusion. And then that becomes just a performative contradiction, because all of the science being done by all these illusory beings using all of their illusory equipment, making all of their illusory statements, is the science. Here's an axiom I work by. If the referent of knowledge is real, the knowledge itself has to be real. And so if, right, the knowledge of the bottom physics says, well, the bottom physics is real, the knowledge, the information, the higher level has to equally be real. And so what I'm saying is our notion of reality isn't bound, right, anymore to solid, inert objects. That table over there is a dynamical system. It's constantly changing and in flux. Do I say it's not real because it's not a Cartesian soul-like thing? Of course not. But while we have been very willing to loosen up what we mean by real out there, if you'll allow me the Cartesian metaphor, we're not willing to loosen up what real means in here. So when we start talking about the self as real or not real, we're saying it's real or not real the way people in the 17th century used to think of objects. And that's like, it's crazy. Like, why are we using that as our standard? That's a ridiculous thing. And I don't understand this. So I want to, like, do you guys have thoughts on that? Why do we equivocate on our standard of realness when we talk about the reality of objects and the reality of the self? There's a weird thing that goes on there. And I think part of the resistance to the phase transition is an attachment to this moribund metaphysics of the self that we don't extend to anything else, as far as I can tell.
So I just want to make sure I'm getting it. So the thing that, what is it that we're resistant to? The sense of what can objects do that we can't do? It doesn't apply to us. What's the thing?
Well, no, what I was trying to say, guys, sorry, I was probably dumped a bathtub of words I didn't mean. What I meant was when people are talking about, when they say the self is real. I like
the bath, by the way, it was good.
When they say the self is real or not real, there's an underlying presupposition that what they mean is something is real if it's a solid, unchanging substance in both the Cartesian and the Aristotelian sense. And anything other than that is an illusion. And what I'm saying is we gave up Aristotelian and Cartesian metaphysics for our science a hell of a long time ago. And we don't conclude, well, you know what? All of this is an illusion. Some people do, but they don't do it in any way that is in any way consistent, right? Because they'll say things, well, is evolution real? Well, yeah. Well, evolution isn't at the bottom level of quantum mechanics. Is it? So is evolution real? Did it really happen? Well, yeah. Okay, then that means, you know, organisms are real and they really reproduce, et cetera, et cetera.
But the point you're making, the question you're putting out there, which is that you perceived, and I as you were saying it, noticed, yeah, I also sense this is an accurate perception, that there is a particular kind of resistance around the inquiry into, well, precisely what is the change around the nature of self that we need to be dealing with.
Yeah.
There's something about like you. So the example you're giving is that there's this, in fact, absurd, and either conscious or unconscious, but absurd attachment to a 300-year-old metaphysics that it clearly has no gravity to it. But the point is that that's an indicator, that is a symptom of the fact that there is something going on around this particular object that holds it at a level of protectiveness and or lack of being able to actually see it. Like it has that. To me, what came up was very much along the lines of, okay, when something like that shows up in me, my normal orientation is to say, okay, what trauma are my defense mechanisms protecting right now?
Right.
It has that sensibility to it. Like it has that sensibility of a something in the collective zeitgeist is endeavoring to protect something that is deeply vulnerable and has, dysfunctional defense mechanisms around it.
Yeah.
So therefore, an interesting place to go into inquiry.
Yeah. Therefore, if
Definitely.
I heal my trauma, I may disappear. That's kind of the.
That's right. That's right. It's a preservative. It's a very, very much a preservative instinct, right? Because the moment it's exteriorized to a level of abstraction that subjects it to the moving goalposts of this dimension of the scientific enterprise, all of a sudden it becomes subject to dispossession, subject to loss.
Right.
And at a time when everything is so subject to loss, I think we are loath to reframe something in such a way that we can lose it. Right. Jung said this, right? The greatest risk of having a soul is the risk of losing the soul. And to formulate it in such a way as to make it, to expose it contra the vulnerability. Maybe we'll work our way back to that dichotomy is somewhere in here too.
Yeah.
No, I think there's a connection there. There's something about, right. We've talked about, let's use Jordan's gerund. Let's call it selfing. Okay, we've talked about the deep connections between selfing and this kind of distributed relevance realization and intimacy, and how that's transformative and it's valuable to us, right? But so there's a lot to be gained potentially by moving, right? But so what is it? Because here's my proposal, that what people want is meaning, and that what meaning ultimately involves is this optimal grip between individuation and participation. So I have an intimate connection with others and the world, and I can fall in love with being again. That's a proposal I've argued for already. So there's a lot arguing for this new way of conceiving the self. What is it we would be losing such that we are willing to absurdly bind ourselves in this one special, maybe narcissistic instance to a moribund metaphysics? What is it we would be losing? Because there's a lot on offer. What Jordan did a few minutes ago, and what Guy did with intimacy, and what you've done, Chris, with around Eros, there's a lot there for this what we might look like on the other side of the transition. There's a lot on offer. What is it we might be losing that is so holding us back?
It's like one of the things that comes up is it just seems that so much of the Cartesian sense of the self is certainty, is seeking certainty through inference, and it to such a degree, right, where it's so insidious, because it's like, I know that I am because I think. I know that I am because you are. I know that I am because you like me. I know that I am because of this thing. I know that I am all the way down to the most subtlest levels, and that there's even the wanting not to have an inference becomes the thing in which gets the whole thing going, right? This sense of an insidiousness that's like
yeah,
down, right? So there is this quality of, like, first, if we kind of look at the phenomena of what that is like, right? All you got to do is start to want something different, and you'll just notice even the act of wanting something different is like constituting the whole thing, right? And if you think about it too, it's like I think there's a lot here around the narcissistic myth.
Yeah, for
Oh,
sure.
massively. So check it. This dropped in, Guy, while you were like, so you've got like a selfing machine, right? We're just kind of like a certain kind of crank that converts something into self. And your guy, Tom Hanks, right? His selfing machine was running out of material, so it was like, oh, it's not working. Right? Things aren't cranking through this selfing machine. So we had to start putting the right kind of material to be able to get a selfing machine to get a grip and start churning out self. Think like remember those little that Play-Doh extruder when you were a kid?
Yeah.
You ran out of Play-Doh, dude. You couldn't crank any more star-shaped, poop. So you had to find more Play-Doh. So you had to create Wilson, right? And that's one level. Like one level is like if you're running out of Play-Doh, your selfing machine's starting to be on the fritz. But what we're talking about is the selfing machine itself is getting tossed. I would say, hey, it's not with the ability to kind of crank experience and convert it into a self. We're talking about actually that thing, that wave that you're weaving, as you said already. Like if I double click on the notion of it's a narrative frame, right? It's all about telling a self-authoring story, self-authoring itself. And if I double click on that and say, nope, not that anymore, beep, beep, then you're like, oh, I don't have a selfing machine at all anymore. So it's not that I actually lose myself. I actually lose my capacity to end self, or as my friend Zach Stein puts it, to end soul, which is an
right.
That would be a scary thing, right? Like not just like losing yourself, but losing the capacity to be self at all. You'd imagine like as soon as part of you orients, like feels that coming at you, it's like, fuck that, like steer clear of that deep primal, like don't let that go down. And of course, as we're proposing, that's what reality is throwing at us. Reality is saying, hey guys, guess what? Play-Doh is about to be, no longer available. And there's not going to be any reparations for your little hand clamp when it breaks. So you best get to working on something else. I'll just throw one last piece on, John. The last piece is, I think it's really killer to load this in the frame of design. Like you actually put some really interesting things together when you were talking about it. In terms of, I thought of it as sort of like verticality and horizontality, like continuity through time and continuity with the whole of universe, or with the whole in time. We're in a situation right now where it actually it's more like not like what is, but rather how do we? Like how do we actually? What are the design criteria of what a selfing machine would look like that we're going to have to get around building? That's that's the new question. So it's not the question is what is self or is self real, which is of course is sort of a lame question. But it's actually all right. Well, how do we go about designing a selfing machine that is responsive to the reality that we actually find ourselves in? Which is neat. Like that's actually really neat. It's like super empowering. Like, okay, it's not that we're going to be
ground right there. Just that question puts it on a completely different ground.
Yeah.
That's a completely different question of like, oh, the self as a responsiveness to what is needed in its world. And that's the thing about world self sense of things, of where, and I think this is what Nishitani really gets at in Religion and Nothingness, is this quality of the home ground. It's like nothing from the home ground of the Cartesian self is the thing to like avoid and infer your way out of, but like from the ground of the object or the tree or the nothingness and emptiness, from where the self is something like clearing for world, right?
Yeah,
that is its reason for being, right? It's not a thing in the world. It's there in someone to be a profound observer of it, a participatory observer in some way.
You could put those two points together, though, right?
John,
the idea
JV move right there.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I heard Jordan saying that the reason why we stay in the moribund metaphysics is it prevents us from asking the question that we need to be asking right now, right? So what metaphysics do, right, is they frame what's questionable and what's not questionable. And the Cartesian metaphysics prevents us from getting to the question, not of, what the self is, but, what the self, what we no longer have, as Jordan put it, the selfing machine. And then what what I heard Guy doing was he says, okay, I'm going to jump outside of Cartesian metaphysics and I'm going to move to Nishitani's metaphysics, because that isn't a metaphysics just of actuality and stuff. It's a metaphysics of possibility and openness and process, right? And from there we can try and ask Jordan's question. It feels like we could do some work there to put those two pieces together more dialogically, to get them to really sing together.
Right, because then the question becomes how, like, by what prospect can a selfing machine be regrown except from within selflessness, right? And
Yes.
there's part of Nishitani again, right? And so then if
that's beautiful. What's the right selflessness? Because there's all kinds of selflessness that doesn't grow the selfing machine, right?
So a selfless, yeah, exactly. So it's like what we seek then is a selflessness that can be actual to selfhood.
Right.
Because a selflessness that can be actual to selfhood all of a sudden becomes within range of its parlance, becomes within range of its capacity to seek it.
Right.
It's like the non-being beyond being, John, that you right
yes.
from Porphyry, right?
Yeah.
The non-being, right? The non-being, the non-being from beyond being.
So that minuscule fraction of the infinite that has its disposition, the characteristic of reifying itself into the finite.
Yes.
Beautifully put. Yes, that precisely.
Yeah, little dyslexic God.
Yeah. And check it. So then what you end up having is you can basically just work backwards, right? Because John's saying the thing is about being able to have, I'm sorry, your words, I lost them, but conformity, like a optimal grip.
Optimal grip, yeah.
Right. It's like, okay, well, if I'm a software designer and I'm in the infinite space, I'm like, hey, I'm creating a selfing machine that's going to instantiate me in some particular domain in finitude. I want to make sure that my selfing machine is particularly well designed to be able to instantiate myself in optimal grip with whatever domain I find myself in. Right? It needs to be actually an end modal, bespoke selfing machine that's sent to the characteristics of the domain it finds itself in. It's all about its domain specific, right? If you think about like, if let's put it like as a really kind of crusty science fiction metaphor, if I'm a disembodied intelligence living in a computer in the cloud, and I'm going to drop myself into an android body walking around on a planet, and one planet's going to be Jupiter, and another planet's going to be like, Mars or Pluto. One android body needs to be able to float above the clouds and be diaphanous. The other android body needs to be able to deal with absolute zero. Right? It's kind of like, that's a really nice old-fashioned 50s style sci-fi version of it. Obviously, Jupiter is a human milieu, and Pluto is a human milieu in some kind of changing context of what's going on. And the instantiation has to do with the selfness that is appropriate to the human milieu that I find myself in, which could be context specific.
By the way, there is a story called "Call Me Joe" by Poul Anderson, which is a classic that does exactly that. Right. But I was thinking, it might be worthwhile to think about that story in a sec. But I was thinking, what you're saying sounds to me like, right? We need a way of constructing the selfing machine that will make a selfing machine that always makes a multi-self, not a singular substantial self. Right. So we've had all of our previous selfing machines were selfing machines that made selves, monadic selves. But what we need is a selfing machine that makes a multi-self. I'm picking up on the idea of multi-aptness, right? And so what I have is a multi-self that is capable of refitting itself across different environments. One of the things you should know about the story, by the way, Jordan, is it's intriguing, is that Joe is, and then they did a bit of a riff on it with that horrible movie Avatar. Joe actually comes to prefer, he's a human being in space, and he's largely sort of paraplegic, but he avatars into this very powerful organism on the planet, and he comes to prefer more and more that Joe rather than the Joe that's the human Joe. And so Anderson does this amazing thing with playing with, again, your sense of self being really constitutive of yourself. So that brings me phenomenologically to the point. We can talk about this metaphysically, which we could continue to do. It's great. But the phenomenology would be how, so another question comes up. I'm just going to keep asking you guys questions. We have to how do we train people so that they have a sense of self that affords the multi-self, allows the self machine to come into existence that will be multi-selfing rather than mono-selfing. What's the phenomenology of that?
Just really quick, I want to go back. So I get this clear. So the multi-selfing, what is multi-selfing?
So well, I understood what Jordan to be saying is, right, we have to constitute a selfing machine that is going to be multi-app to give us optimal grip in whichever context, the Jupiter context or the Pluto context or the Terran context. And I'm calling that the multi-self. It's a self, right, that it's a selfing machine that is constantly making the self to have different kinds of optimal grips.
And so just to kind of do it in the language of design,
right.
One characteristic is it must maintain some form of continuity.
Yes.
Obviously, we have some notion that John and Chris and Guy and Jordan are not the same selves, right? So there's a discontinuity here. And we have some notion that Jordan is Jordan, even though moments have passed since the beginning of this event. There's a continuity there, right? So there's one design characteristic of a selfing machine is there needs to be some notion of continuity across what may be a diversity of instantiations through time, and by the way, also in space. Second is there needs to be a felt sense, and I would say actually an upgradient, so an increasing felt sense through instantiations of optimal grip in the domain that one finds oneself in. So it's both good at instantiating selves in this sort of the actual sense, in context, and sensitive to particular context, and the process by which it does that, guys, kind of goes back to that notion of the sort of the intimacy, the transformative potential. It also is designed such that it doesn't hold so tightly to its instantiation that it cannot learn and grow, i.e. it returns back into something that is not domain bound and grows in its capacity to enself itself, or to ensoul, again, to use Zach's notion, as it comes back in. The third characteristic is that there is this, whatever this horizontal or this connectedness with the larger whole is also maintained. So there's a continuity horizontal, and a continuity with a felt sense of continuity, of kinship or connectedness with Chris, John, and Guy, while maintaining that continuity with something that is distinct from, right? So you've got continuity with that which is unique and singular. You've got continuity with that which is distinct and different. And you've got this capacity to iterate through instantiations in domains that are not bound to the domain, but have the capacity to release back out to the transcendent, which is that which is XX, a given domain, and learns from the process, increases or upgrades its capacity to go through all of this as it does so. So that would be the provisional design spec for the thing that we're talking about, I would propose.
And narrative used to do that for us. Narrative used to give us all of those things.
Yeah, I can retell my story. I can bend it. I can shift it. Yeah.
Continuity.
The interesting thing too about narrative. Go ahead, John. Chris.
Well, I was just going to say, we've never had logical identity or numerical or substantial identity. I don't share, like I do weird, freaky things, like point at a picture of me as a 2-year-old and go, there I am. Like, what the heck is that? We're not logically identical. Right. And so the way, so we can never ground the continuity in identity, in the logical sense of identity. And narrative gives us a non-logical sense of identity. Some narrative does this thing where it says, somehow, non-logically, you're the same, because there's a story that gives you the continuity, and there's a story that gives you the connectedness, right? You've got the plot and you've got the setting, and the plot and the setting belong together. Narrative did all of that. But if we go back to our original thing, the way we grounded narrative in our psychology is being deeply undermined. The way we're undermining narratives in our political spheres. Postmodernism is an attack on the idea of narrative. So the idea of narrative being able to do this for us anymore has serious. It was the selfing machine. It was the machine that made the selves, right? But we don't have that selfing machine available to us, at least not in an unproblematic form. And I suspect that it's not the right selfing machine anymore, ultimately. So, Chris, that's what I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm. I wonder about, I wonder about whether, though, narrative is something that in the way that we've talked about recently and written recently with reference to parable.
Yes.
I wonder about the exaptation of narrative
Yes.
as a salvific alternative. Because I understand what you mean, John. Like the entrapments of narrative are there; they're real.
Yeah.
They're and in many ways they're unavoidable if we stay along the sort of that very linear autobiographical narrative tract that we're well accustomed to. But the exaptation of narrative is still something I feel like I think about something like, well, okay. So how do we circle back? What am I trying to say? How do we hit the reset button in some sense? How do we transmogrify ourselves into a new perspective in such a way that the perspective can be homed, and it can be homed with continuity of self, but also the differentiation of self that you were talking about, Jordan. And I think about Nishitani's idea of the sort of the original countenance, right? The original countenance of reality as something originary. And we've talked before about the fact that the horizontality of narrative can become parabolic insofar as it can become sort of exapted to mean and to refer to the verticality of ontological origin, rather than the narrative origin that has its source in wherever the narrative has began, right? Whether it's childhood or whatnot. And so if narrative, and particularly the memory of narrative, can be purposed for a kind of memory that sources intelligibility and the adaptivity of our relationship with intelligibility, right? If our memory of our grandma can be the memory of grandmother, right? If my memory of my brother can become the memory of brother, right? If we can recourse, I'm thinking almost in a formal, I don't know if this is sufficient, I suspect it's not, but in a formal or an archetypal sense, to use the memory of narrative as a way of recoursing to an intelligible source from which that memory becomes meaningful. And of course, parables do something very similar to that, as we've discussed. So there's something about, I don't have this clear, obviously, but there's something about there's something about the purposing of the narrative form and the exaptation of that narrative form into a device into a kind of originary ontology, or a way of accessing an originary ontology from which we can reproduce selfhood in its multi-aptness.
Okay, try this. So there was a point at some time in the past, and I think it was Gilles Deleuze, but I'm not sure, where I remember imagining a diagram that he was talking about the fact there's a particular mathematical transformation that could be made, where you could either describe a force as a set of vectors, or you could in some sense talk about it as the set of vector spaces that always would point and ordinate towards what would be the trajectory on the line. So the example would be, I could look at a topological map, and I could talk about a river either as the basin that actually has water flowing through it, or I could talk about it as the vector space of the sloping of the hills that point towards that location. That flip is the flip that I'm proposing, right? So what I started showing up for me as you were talking, to say, hey, let us think about the notion of narrative no longer as the linearity of the river flowing, but rather as the ordinating basis in the context of all that could be, orienting us in a consistent direction. So it's a way of maintaining some kind of consistency and continuity.
Possibility.
It's a symbolic map, rather. It becomes a symbolic map. Yeah, that's good.
Shift, Chris, that you and I've been talking about. It's that fundamental act. It's a figure ground reversal that Nishitani talks a lot about, right? It's a figure ground reversal. So So, I mean, the thing about parable, I mean, and here I'm making use of Sally McFagg's work, and we made use of it in our recent article, is the idea about parables look like narratives, but they're not, because they don't resolve. And the point is, if you try to resolve them into an allegory or a lesson, you've lost the parable. My favorite one is the prodigal son, right? The parable of the prodigal son is like, if you at different points in your life, you will identify with the different roles, the elder son, the father, the prodigal son, and you'll see the tension between tradition, justice, and compassion, because we're responsible creatures, but we're also subject to fate, but we also exist across. And so the point is, if you try to resolve the prodigal son, you've lost it. If you try and say, if you try to do the narrative thing to it, you've lost it. You've lost the tonos, the tension between the individuation and participation. The point is to be caught up in that and to inhabit it. And that, to me, Jordan, sounds like your vector space. Instead of trying to get the river that runs through it, good movie, by the way, instead of getting the river that runs through it, what a parable does is put you back out into, oh no, what's actually going on is this tensor space continually between individuation, participation, justice, compassion, etc.
It's telescopic.
Here's the thing: is how do you so in a self that wants that, right? Like it seems that this is how does one begin to want that which if I went into it not wanting it, I'd be traumatized. But if I go into it embracing it, wanting it, right, there's a sense of almost a reverse trauma, right? This kind of sense in which it's like to want what doesn't have a word yet, to want this space that's outside of the frame, right? There's this part of I think a big part of this is like how do we get a self to want to live in a parable, right? What is the difference that makes that difference such that someone wakes up and they're attracted to that which would enlighten them, per se?
Well,
wanting that parable somehow must become synonymous with wanting oneself.
but that's the
Right.
Socratic project.
Yeah, exactly.
The Socratic project. The Socratic project is to make that happen. That's exactly the Socratic project.
Yeah, what I would say is that it probably comes along the lines of something like practice. As we've said many times, there's the experience of undergoing a choice, the threshold of which is intrinsically transformative. But if you've done that 6 or 7 times, you begin to have this felt sense of, okay, this is one of those portals again. I know that I will not survive going through the portal, but I've done this enough times to know that something will happen that goes through that portal that is very attractive, that is the thing to be done, right? So I don't think it's the kind of thing that can be can be taught, but it's the kind of thing that can be learned.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was trying to allude to with the Socratic project, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get you drop, first of all, you drop out of narrative into that which is presupposed in all narrative and enlivens all narrative, which is dialogos. Dialogos is the matrix from which narrative emerges, right? And you drop out of it. And then what you do once you drop into dialogos, just like narrative can be turned into parable, you can drop into dialogos and convert it into something like a koan, right? And then and then what you get is you get an intimacy with the thing that you've always feared. The nothingness of nihilism becomes the no thingness from which you can have the most profound connection and intimacy. And you can fall in love with that deeper than you can fall in love with anything. That's the claim. And I think that is the Neoplatonic claim. I think it's the Zen claim that is, but that make you, it's like saying, you know what? You're going to really love that woman someday. like unless you're in the process of falling in love, it doesn't make any sense to you. But as Jordan said, once you start to practice it and once you get caught up in it, then you start to say, oh, right, now I know why I'm falling in love with this person.
And then if you can enculture the possibility that the self, that your self will and must emerge in the, like, if I begin to understand myself as as emergent from within, the sort of the selfless aporia of that encounter, and then emanated from in behind it at the same time, then I start to realize, my fear or my anxiety becomes gradually disabused.
Yes.
Because as I practice uncovering and discovering myself within that kind of encounter begins to become more and more attractive to me.
Yeah.
Because
yeah,
I begin to anticipate mine own emergence.
You have that experience as a mature person, right? So not as an adolescent, but as a mature person, where you have that sense of, oh, I think I'm falling in love with this person. This is going to be interesting. I know for sure it's going to be a hell of a ride, and there's probably going to be all kinds of crazy ups and downs, and that's the ride I'm on. That's the nature of the ride, the ticket I bought when I came into this thing. And you can get better at it. You can actually have the conversation. I think I'm falling in love with you. Can we kind of navigate this together in a mature and skillful fashion? That would be interesting. Like that I think that's nice, right? You can start saying, hey, this is that kind of thing. We can move from kind of like aversion to acceptance, to willingness, to skillfulness, to imagine what it'd be like to be in mastery of this particular kind of practice.
Yeah. So for me, that's the kind of knowing thyself that's at the core of the Socratic project.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a little bit what's happening right now on some level. Yeah. Like I was popping out a few times and just observing us in this experience. And in many ways, I think I would imagine this is what I'm most attracted to about this, is because on some level it feels almost like a symbol, right? For a symbol and a practice to ideally situate my situation in my life, right?
Okay, so that's the thing, right? So we've been talking about it, I think, for the most part, from the point of view of the legacy notion of there's four selves in this conversation. But of course, there's a fifth. And our skillfulness in selving has to do very much so with our capacity to sense into what is wanting to emerge in that fifth in this moment, in the context of now, and to be able to get good at it. I noticed it. I'm sure everybody here noticed as well. Like we're kind of rusty. Like it took a while for us to kind of get back in the swing of things. Yeah. And then as you just kind of reminded me to pop out. It's like, oh wow, I actually lost track of things. I was very much in the flow of things for some period of time. I don't know how we've actually been talking now. And we dropped back in. So we found our way back into it. So we're kind of like novices, but not like newbies when it comes to this, and selving in the Sangha modality.
Right.
And then we have our fractal, like, I got to practice it in this thing that is often going to be referred to as Jordan. But in many cases, actually part of that practice is so that I can actually show up and do it in that which is not yet named. And then maybe there's even more beyond that I can't actually even access just yet because I'm not yet capable of even going to that level. Like that feels like that's a lot of the future of the self is moving through that process of skillfulness and into mastery and selving in the fractal domain.
And the it that we found our way back into, what's that?
That's Toby. No, it is the self that is something that is in selving itself through the wholeness of us.
Yeah.
But now recomposed from the differentiated parts that are now even more differentiated than we were when last we met.
Sure enough.
Right. And so then there's a greater gap. There's a temporal gap that differentiates those selves from the selves of our past. And so that catch-up time did take a little longer, as you said, Jordan, but now that we're reintegrating, there's a way in which we're reintegrating more with an even greater conformity, precisely because of the distance of the gap that had to be reminded in the process of coming back together.
Oof, man.
That's really good.
tippity tappity. By the way, that answers the question that somebody asked earlier, which is what was the purpose of my trip? And the purpose of my trip was to create as much gradient between the person you interacted with before to the person you interact with now as I could produce in a sort of responsible fashion, so as to enable this perspective to show up.
Jordan, that to me, what you've just said is really, to me, the function of travel in the first place, by the way. That is the virtue of travel. That is its function. That's its, like, that's the to me, that's the existential and the philosophic function of travel is to induce precisely that experience.
Well, the word theoria originally meant to travel to see something you hadn't seen before. That's the original meaning of the word theoria.
Oh, wow. So it was the theoretical journey.
Well, at least but in the sense of theoria. So that really, so that's interesting because, you know, the fifth, or we called it the third factor, we call it Geist because we're trying to, a German word that sort of hangs between, right? I mean, that gets us, I mean, I'll speak the word because we invoke it when we say spirituality, but that invokes spirit, right? And we've been talking about, you know, we're trying to reinvent your soul here, basically, because we're trying to get beyond the monadic self back into ensoulment and what that could mean for us without tying ourselves in any way. In fact, liberating ourselves, trying to liberate ourselves from Cartesian Christian metaphysics. And now, can we do the same thing with spirit? Because that's what people used to talk about. That's the word they used to use, you know, back up in the upper Paleolithic transition, I assume, right? When you're around the campfire and you're circling and the third factor, the Geist, the spirit appears, the we space appears, like all this language that people draw out. And we have to think about that. I'm gonna propose we have to think about that in a fundamentally new way too, because if we go back to thinking about that as a thing, soul thing, then we're going to lose what we've moved to. We're going to lose everything that all the space that we've opened up in this dialogos. If we go back, oh, well, that's a spirit and it's made of ectoplasmic goo and blah, 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 right? And so, right. And of course, I'm doing this because I'm also alluding to what Nishitani wanted to talk about, which is spirituality. And we have a post-self notion of spirit that renews spirituality, such that the ensouling, enselfing of us and the geisting among us can talk to each other again in a mutually affording fashion that is not bound to a moribund metaphysics. That's what I'm asking.
When you said that, I felt warm tickles everywhere.
Yeah. So that's a yes. That's a yes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, what I heard was something along the lines of it actually becomes the problem collapses to something in some sense very simple to state, which is that spirituality is the practice of becoming masterful in ensoulment in the fractal domain.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of done and done, but easier said than done. Like really hard to be done.
Yeah.
But then it gets really cool. Like, you know, when folks come and say, as perhaps often happens in some of the comment streams, yeah, you know, various kinds of religious traditions have been talking about this sort of thing for a long time. My response now is, cool, let's get better at it. Let's just get really, really good at it. Let's do that thing you guys have been talking about. And I think part of it is to have a lot less hanging on it that is committed to the preferred nomenclature and the set of adjectives that happen to have been accumulated around the ectoplasm over the past X thousands of years. Right. And sort of focus on the capacity to orient towards what good tone is. Like we just get good at it, and then we can worry about talking about it in a different moment.
I think that's right. I think that's fundamentally right. I think ecologies of practices is ultimately what this has to be about.
And listening, right? Hearkening.
Yep.
Right, which goes back into the sense of, because I've been feeling it in the conversation of, as we've been talking about coming back in to something that we've been in some sense out of and then coming back in, I've been more in the noticing the present moment experience of just being here with everyone And there's a thing about hearkening, which my understanding is essentially about a deep form of obedience, right? Of, and it's interesting because to obey, to really obey is a, it's not something that anybody could do to you, right? It's like to really obey, right? To become deeply fitted, right? And so I've been feeling into, well, what is that? What is that? What is that fifth factor or that third factor? Or like there is a sense in which I'm feeling myself attempting to obey it, to 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 to, to deeply listen and to indwell in it. And I'm noticing I'm kind of, there is a quality of listen, yes, that there is a quality of hearkening, there is a quality of listening. And in some sense, we've all had that experience where we've been in a noisy place, right? And we're not even thinking about anything in particular. And all of a sudden, we just hear the sound of our own name. Yeah. And it's like everything, like all the animals hush. And then you're like, oh, as if there was something listening to the sound of your own name the whole time, right? There's that quality of, this is one of the things that's interesting to me about this, and to see what this, if as we kind of bring this into this thing about the self and about wanting, about listening, that which is, there is this quality of when I hear it, there is a quality of remembering, of like, but it's not like I really necessarily knew I was listening for it. But when I hear it, I realize that that's all I've been listening, like I've been listening for my life, right? That recollection of, and in some ways I feel that these conversations have in many ways helped me and helped me practice, you could say, making sure the right people are doing this towards the right thing, right? Like, there's a listening going on that's always already there. And so there is this part of the self, which I would imagine is more historical in a certain sense, right? That's connected to origin, that has a historicity to it, right? That has a gravity to it, right? But in such a way that it's that there's something about it that has you open with more sophistication to what's beyond it, right? And so
but that's the Socratic notion, or the Platonic notion of eros, right? Eros is simultaneously knowing and not knowing, right? If you didn't know at all, you wouldn't have a need, you wouldn't be drawn. If you knew, you wouldn't move. Yeah. And so Plato does that weird pseudo etymology of, it's sort of, the eros is a mixture of, what is it, privation and I can't remember what it is, but the two Greek words. But the idea is eros is between. Eros is you know and you don't know, and so you're drawn beyond yourself. But you're drawn to something other than yourself, because if you just knew, all you do would be to confirm, listen to the language, confirm, right? And if you didn't know, you wouldn't move, right? There's nothing, right? But it's the combination, and so I mean, and that circles around to intimacy. Like I've been thinking a lot about this, Guy, because you say this a lot, and I don't mean in a belaboring way. You say, it's like I remember. But I didn't know. And I was thinking about, because Chris talks a lot about this, I was thinking, what it feels to me like you're putting your finger on is the fundamental erotic impulse. And I don't mean the sexual impulse. I mean eros, in that about us, which simultaneously knows and doesn't know, right? That's how you get outside of Meno's paradox, right? Because if you know, you don't look. And if you don't know at all, you won't recognize it when you find it. You need something that's in between, and that's eros, and that is gifted to us. It is not something that the self makes. It is something that the self emerges from,
Yeah,
right?
Primordial.
Yes, it has to be. It has to be. Because if the self tries to appropriate that function, and you think about all the ways in which people try to conquer eros and make it their possession or their weapon, and how that destroys them. We have great literature abounding on that, right? Because if you try to do that, then the self becomes bound by Meno's paradox. It gets locked into itself, right? This is the fundamental Socratic thing. We are the transjective beings. We are metaxu. We are between the animal and the divine. We are always between, right? I don't know if this is helping, but that memory you're talking about, I think it's the memory of eros. It's the memory that is awakened in you when you eat chocolate for the first time, right? And you go, oh, right? You don't know what chocolate was, but man, somehow you were led to it, and when you get it, you go, ah, right, chocolate, right? That's eros.
Right.
And there's something like deeply mysterious about that for us,
Yes.
because it is at a level below narrative. It is even at a level below dialogos, right? It's at this really deep level. And what Socrates was trying to do was, turn the narrative into parable, turn the dialogue into koan, so that we could drop all of that machinery down into eros. So
I
that
want
the eros,
that. Yes.
You want that?
I want that self.
Yeah.
I want that self that comes out of there. I want that.
Yes.
That one.
Yes. Yeah. That's the Socratic project. And that's why you either follow Socrates or you kill him. There's no other alternative for you. Same thing with Jesus. You either follow him or you kill him. Same thing.
Recently found a book of poetry that I'd written a number of years ago. May I read a poem?
Sure. I'm happy with that.
Kind of speaks to some of this. It's called The Most Asking Question. You planned it this way, didn't you, God? You knew to put yourself just out of our grasp. It's the space between us where we must widen, oh, so completely unfold to feel the untouchable spot. Ask the unanswerable question and deny ourselves the never satisfied desire that constantly wiggles in our belly. Is this the place, God? The gap between you and I that is the window where you stand and peer out upon the making. Is that you feeling yourself in my strain? Is that you, God, sitting just behind my eyes as I look for you, walking in circles? When the leaf dances delicately in the wind, and for a moment we trade places and beauty breathes me. Is that you who is satisfied? And is it me wanting more?
That's beautiful. When did you write that?
I think in my early 30s. So 40, I think I'm 48 now. So 15 years ago. But it's like I've been praying lately. Been going out to the little dock on a little like a lake here in Alameda, and every morning I've been just making a ritual of like meditating the sun up, and I found myself in like really in the depth of it, finding myself praying. And I don't know how I feel about God, or I don't have much thoughts about all of that kind of stuff, or I don't have an anxiety about the existence of God or anything like that. It's like that's not really like there for me. However, it's like when I've been praying, there is this experience, and I think it speaks to a little bit of like what we're circling around here a bit. It is a real, having not prayed for a long time and now coming back into and praying, there is a quality of this sense. It's a strange intimacy that I feel. It's a really strange intimacy. There is a sense where there's a hesitation of like, I don't like who's talking to who and who's listening to who. But there is this quality of hiddenness, right? Of concealment that is, I think, also so much part of being a self is this relationship to concealment and hiddenness. Which
that's
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say when you said hiddenness and concealment, to me that maybe predictably, Eros is the first thing that comes to mind, because really what it is a combination of concealment and conveyance.
Exactly.
Concealment and conveyance, and when the two are coupled, then the recollective sense of something being knowable and familiar is matched to its infinite mystery. I think about that. I've had a very similar thought, Guy, about, this is going to sound very silly perhaps, I had that thought about Christmas. Yesterday I went and I got myself a tree, which is the first time I've done that. Living alone, it's the first time I've actually gone and got myself a real Christmas tree and put it up and put some lights on it. And, Christmas for me has been largely, as an adult, has been by and large emptied of the value that I associate with its youth, it's certainly in my life. And yet I felt the beginnings, the stirrings of something that I might call the Christmas spirit. I thought, well, what is this Christmas spirit? And to me, it's an interesting way, I was going to say, and it's an analog. It's not an analog. It is, in actuality, an instance of the geistly entity we talked about, within which we can find ourselves impersonally, beyond a personal memory. Because I have this feeling of Christmas, I have this feeling of the Christmas spirit, that there is more to it to be bared, beyond my memory of it as a child, right? Beyond the facts of its gifts and the facts of its fruits spent in company, sort of in the recesses of my memory. I have this sense in which it still conceals itself. And it conveys itself sometimes in the costume of specific memory. But its locus is not in any specific memory. It's just costumed by those memories. And it's concealed within and beyond those memories. The memories partake of it, but the memories can't reduce it. It's of me, but it's not of me. Anyway, all of those feelings, at least as inklings, started to surface when I started to turn my attention back and forward simultaneously to whatever this nameless entity is. And what's so interesting to me is that the sort of the mysterium of its concealment is actually costumed in a fairy tale for kids, right? The fairy tale of Santa Claus. There's tremendous concealment to that, right? It crackles with suppressed mystery. That's the art, the great ennobling lie of Santa Claus is precisely the concealment of what is inmost and real, costumed by the countenance of that spirit. And yet I still feel the presence of that, even though, of course, the context of the specific fairy tale, the actuality of that fairy tale has passed away. But what it attempts to convey, I'm trying to nose it out. It's not fully manifest. It's just an inkling, but it's enough. It's enough to start sniffing it again. Of course, having a tree, it literally has a fragrance that I can use as an analog for the sniffing out of the Christmas spirit, which is, of course, its function.
It's so much.
Just make you think of the scent of
solitary
time.
for you, Chris.
Fragrance.
Yes, well, Han, yeah, absolutely, has been on my mind too.
And then
Yeah.
Han and the agony of Eros, and the thing you did about, right, that you're trying to get the optimal grip between conveyance and concealment. And that's what intimacy, and that's how intimacy, erotic intimacy, differs from pornography. Pornography discloses everything, and there is no right tonos. There's no that's Han's whole argument, right? That the otherness, the hiddenness, the concealment that is beyond my grasp is lost in pornography because there's no intimacy. The full disclosure robs the depth. There's no concealment, and the conveyance turns completely consumptive. It in no way has to, and listen to my language, please. It in no way has to give itself over to the other. That is required in intimacy. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about taking a narrative that is more abundant for you as a narrative and making it into a parable again, a parable that gets you into the tonos that is necessary for intimacy so that Eros can flourish. That's what
exactly
I hear you
right.
saying.
That's exactly right. And the specific memories, the memories of personal narrative are only necessary insofar as they help to conduce the form of attunement that turns me into that state.
Yes. Yeah. But that's the acceptation of narrative that you were
That's it.
for.
That's it.
Right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Like what you're doing is basically you're getting the parabolic structure because, right, the idea, like Santa Claus represents this unresolvable thing about us, right? And if you get into he exists or he doesn't exist, which is like the silly arguments that does God exist or not exist, you've lost the parable, you've reduced it down to a narrative, and then you've applied logical identity to it, which is just mistake after mistake after mistake. But if you take it back up into the parable, don't resolve Santa Claus. That's the answer. I mean, in a very important way. I can't believe I'm saying these sentences. Don't resolve Santa Claus, because if Santa Claus becomes a parable for you, a narrative that constantly undermines itself as a narrative, as anything that has a historical telos to it, or et cetera, then you can actually cultivate the intimacy.
Yes,
that's right.
Makes Eros come into its fullness.
Right.
That's right. Incidentally, that is one of Jonathan Lear's arguments for the function of Plato's noble lie, is precisely as a narrative that undermines itself in order to produce dialectical process that does exactly what you've just described.
Exactly.
That's why I describe it as a noble lie, because I think effectively that's what it is. That's its function. Yeah, that's really good, John. Yeah.
Talking about that, Chris, I just felt so much love for you. Really did.
I return it.
So I noticed there's by the way, I have to go leave and get a Christmas tree in a few moments. There's an interesting inverse similarity between the form of participation that Guy was talking about and the form of participation that Christopher's talking about. So in the context of prayer, the challenge that we often run into is that the form endeavors to present itself as being the thing and distracts us from the thing that it is supposed to simply be pointing us towards. Right? In the context of Christmas, the form distracts us from the thing, instead of pointing us towards the thing to which it should be pointing us. It doesn't interpose itself as being the thing, but it perfectly pulls us away from the thing in a very similar and yet inverted way. So what I hear both of you saying is that there is a reawakening of an awareness of the sensibility and the sensitivity and the meaningfulness and the necessity of recovering a capacity to listen, to hear the tone of the thing, And then the resacralization of the form, re-energized from the bottom up, and then coming back out, and the recrafting of the rituals connected to the thing so that they can remind us back to the place we're supposed to. So
That's
it's
beautiful,
Merry
Jordan.
Christmas.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful.
And that's an instance of the selfing.
Right.
What you guys just did was the instance of the selfing, right? Right,
Ooh.
just doing it. You were just doing it right there. Chris we participated in friendship with Chris doing the inselfing. He was doing it right there.
Like I said, I feel so much love.
All right, guys, thanks for getting the band back together.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. This has been wonderful, truly wonderful.
I'll put out another. I'll put another invite at some point.
That's good.
Count me in.
All right.
Yep, absolutely.
See y'all
Thanks,
again.
gentlemen.
Take care, everyone. Much love.